The rain came down in heavy sheets, turning the road into a river of mud. My old Chevrolet Impala's wipers squeaked, fighting to clear the windshield, but they could barely keep up. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. It was a miserable night to be out, but tonight was important. It was our 44th wedding anniversary. 44 years with Maggie. The passenger seat held a bouquet of roses, rain droplets from the florist still clinging to the petals. Next to them was a carefully wrapped bottle of her favorite wine. I had rehearsed the moment in my head, imagining the way her eyes would light up when she saw the flowers, the smile that would spread across her face. Despite everything life had thrown at us, the arguments, the losses, the quiet moments where love felt like an old, worn-out song, I believed this night could remind us of the spark that started it all. But as I turned onto our street, a sense of unease crawled up my spine. Our neighborhood was always quiet at this hour. The familiar houses sat in darkness, porch lights off, curtains drawn, as if the whole world had gone to sleep. Everyone, that is, except us. Our house stood out like a beacon, blazing with light in every window. It was like someone had thrown open the curtains and invited the world to look in. My stomach twisted into knots. Something was wrong. Deep down, I knew it before I even pulled into the driveway. Call it intuition, or maybe the kind of instinct that comes from spending 44 years with someone. You just know when something isn't right. And then I saw it. Parked where my Impala should have been was a sleek, black car. It was shiny, expensive-looking, and completely out of place in our neighborhood of aging trucks and sensible family sedans. I didn't recognize it, but the sight of it sent my heart into overdrive. Who the hell could be visiting at this hour? And why was Maggie entertaining someone in the middle of the night? I turned off the engine, and the Impala fell silent, leaving me with nothing but the pounding rain and the roar of blood in my ears. For a moment, I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so hard my fingers ached. I tried to think rationally. Maybe it was something innocent. A neighbor in trouble. A family emergency. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was lying to myself. I stepped out of the car, and the rain soaked me instantly. My jacket, my clothes, even my hair were drenched within seconds, but I barely felt it. I moved on autopilot, my legs carrying me toward the house. My boots squelched in the mud, and I stumbled slightly, but I kept going, my mind replaying every argument, every moment I had taken for granted. How many times had Maggie told me she was unhappy? How many signs had I missed? Reaching the side of the house, I saw that the curtain over the kitchen window was half open. The warm glow from inside spilled out, cutting through the gloom. Taking a deep breath, I crept closer, each step heavier than the last. My heart pounded harder, and I could hear my breath coming out in short, uneven bursts. And that's when I saw them. Maggie was sitting at the kitchen table, but she wasn't alone. A man I had never seen sat across from her. He wore a sharp, tailored suit, and he had that polished look of someone who had everything handed to him. His hand rested over hers, and they were laughing together. The kind of laughter that twisted a knife deep into my gut. It was genuine, light, and carefree, the kind of laughter I hadn't heard from Maggie in years. Maggie's eyes were bright, her cheeks flushed, and she looked happy. Younger, even. It was like watching a version of her I'd forgotten existed, a version that didn't need me, didn't miss me. I felt a pang of something ugly and raw. Was this what she had wanted all along? Had I become just a ghost in the life we built together? The pain hit first, sharp and all-consuming. But then came the anger. It was cold, fierce, and relentless. My fists clenched at my sides, and I fought the urge to storm in, to demand answers, to tear this perfect stranger out of my house. But I held back. Something about the way Maggie leaned into him, the way her laughter softened, told me this wasn't just a simple betrayal. There was more to this, something I needed to understand before I made my move. But one thing was certain, I couldn't let them get away with this. The rain continued to pound relentlessly, a constant drumming that seemed to match the deafening thud of my heart in my ears. I stood frozen, just outside the glow of my own home, each breath coming out in short, ragged bursts. The roses I had brought for Maggie were now abandoned, lying in the mud where I had dropped them. The bottle of wine was still in the car, forgotten. I didn't want to think. Thinking hurt. Thinking meant acknowledging the sharp blade of betrayal that twisted deeper every second I stood there. All I wanted was to confront them, to make them feel the pain they had inflicted on me. My fists clenched at my sides, and before I even realized what I was doing, I was moving. The front door was locked. Of course, it was locked. But right now, that was just a minor obstacle. My eyes darted around, and I saw a heavy rock lying near the edge of the front steps, right next to a patch of wilted flowers Maggie used to take care of. Without hesitation, I grabbed it. The rock felt cold and rough in my hand. One quick motion, and I hurled it at the front window. The glass shattered with a loud, satisfying crash, shards raining down inside like jagged tears. The laughter inside the house died instantly. The two figures at the kitchen table jerked back, startled. I saw Maggie's hand fly to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. The man across from her stood up so quickly that his chair toppled backward. The rage inside me was like a living thing, wild and uncontrollable. I stepped over the broken glass and into the house, my boots crunching with each step. The rain followed me in, dripping from my clothes and hair, leaving small puddles on the kitchen floor. My voice cracked with fury. "Who the hell are you?" I roared, the words echoing off the walls. Maggie's face drained of color. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked like a ghost of herself, shrinking back against the counter. The man, on the other hand, tried to recover some of his composure. He held up his hands, palms out, as if trying to defuse the situation. His expensive suit looked ridiculous in the chaos I had created. "Hey, calm down," he said, though his voice trembled. "Let's not do anything we'll regret." Regret? The word tasted bitter in my mouth. I took another step forward, and he backed away, his confidence faltering. "You come into my house, touch my wife, and you think I'll just stand here and be reasonable?" He swallowed hard, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal's. "Look, man, I didn't mean." I didn't let him finish. All the months of feeling neglected, the nights I'd wondered where I went wrong, exploded in that moment. I swung my fist, and it connected with his jaw, hard enough to make my knuckles ache. He stumbled back, crashing into the table. Maggie screamed, but her voice barely registered. My world had shrunk to the sound of my rage and the way his face contorted in pain. The man tried to get up, holding his jaw, but I wasn't done. I grabbed a heavy wooden cutting board from the counter and raised it like a weapon. He stared at me, his eyes wide with terror. Gone was the smooth, confident demeanor. Now he just looked scared. "Get the hell out," I growled, the board still poised to strike. He didn't need to be told twice. Stumbling, he scrambled toward the door, nearly slipping on the wet floor. I followed him, every muscle in my body taut, and as he bolted outside into the storm, I hurled the cutting board at him. It missed, crashing into the porch railing instead. He jumped into his shiny black car, hands fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and he peeled out of the driveway, tires screeching. For a moment, I stood there, drenched and shaking, watching his taillights disappear into the darkness. The adrenaline drained out of me, leaving a sick, empty feeling in its place. I turned back to the house. Maggie was still standing there, clutching the edge of the counter like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Tears streamed down her face, but I couldn't find it in me to feel pity. "How could you?" I demanded, my voice hoarse. I wanted her to answer, to give me a reason, any reason, that would make sense of the mess she had made of our life. But as I looked into her eyes, all I could see was the distance between us. The years, the broken promises, the love that had slowly bled out of our marriage. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The damage was already done, and there was no going back. But one thing was clear, I wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. The rain finally eased to a drizzle, the heavy downpour leaving behind a cold mist that hung low over the neighborhood. I stood there for a moment longer, letting the dampness seep into my bones, feeling the numbness take over as the rage began to simmer down. But the anger didn't disappear. It hardened, became something more focused. Something with purpose. I wasn't about to let Maggie and that stranger walk away from this unscathed. I wasn't going to be the man everyone pitied, the fool whose wife laughed with another man while he was out buying roses. No, I needed a plan. I needed to hit back where it would hurt the most. When I finally stepped back into the house, Maggie was still standing by the doorway. She hadn't moved, as if she was too stunned to react. Her eyes followed me, but I didn't spare her a second glance. I couldn't bear to look at her. Every time I did, I saw those moments of laughter with that man, saw the years of our life together crumbling like sand. "Henry," she started, her voice soft, pleading. "Please, can we just talk?" I shook my head, my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. "There's nothing to talk about," I said, each word coming out colder than I thought possible. "You made your choice." Her shoulders sagged, and she looked like she might fall apart right there. But I wasn't going to be the one to hold her together anymore. I walked past her, went straight for the bedroom, and grabbed a bag. The adrenaline had faded, but a new energy filled me. I couldn't just sit around and wallow in this betrayal. I needed to do something. I took a few clothes and shoved them into the bag, not caring how messy it was. My hands shook, and I hated that. Hated that she could still get to me, that her betrayal had me feeling like a raw, exposed nerve. But I couldn't let that stop me. Not now. Before I knew it, I was back in the kitchen, my phone in hand. There was a number I hadn't called in years, one I thought I'd never need again. My thumb hovered over it for a moment, the memories of a younger, more reckless version of myself surfacing. Back then, I had friends who knew how to handle problems the hard way, people who didn't ask questions. I hit call. The line rang a few times, and then a familiar voice, gruff and tired, picked up. "Henry?" Rick sounded surprised, and I couldn't blame him. We hadn't spoken since our wild days, and I'd worked hard to put that part of my life behind me. "It's me," I said, my voice steady, even though my heart pounded. "I need a favor." Rick paused. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. "A favor?" he echoed, and then his tone shifted. It wasn't friendly, but it was interested. "Well, I'll be damned. Never thought I'd hear you asking for a favor again. What kind of trouble are you in?" I looked out the kitchen window, at the rain-slicked street, and felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. "It's not me who's in trouble," I said, and my voice sounded colder than the night outside. "Someone crossed a line, and I need them to understand there are consequences." Rick let out a low whistle. "Serious business, huh? You sure you want to go down this road, Henry?" I closed my eyes, the image of Maggie laughing with that man burned into my mind. "I've never been more sure," I replied. There was a pause, and then Rick's voice hardened. "All right. Give me the details." I gave him the address of the man's office, the one I had looked up earlier when everything had first started to fall apart. It was a sleek, modern building downtown, the kind of place that reeked of wealth and power. The man probably thought he was untouchable, but I wanted to change that. "Consider it done," Rick said. "You'll hear from me soon." I ended the call, my hands still trembling, but this time it wasn't just from anger. It was from the thrill of taking action, of knowing I wasn't just sitting around waiting for the world to pity me. I was making my move, setting the pieces in motion. Maggie was still in the other room, crying quietly. Her sobs should have broken me, but they only made me feel emptier. I looked around the kitchen, at the broken glass on the floor, at the rain that continued to drip inside from the shattered window. This house had been our sanctuary once. Now, it was a reminder of everything I'd lost. And as I stood there, I knew that the man who had come between us wasn't going to get away with it. Neither of them would. This wasn't about love anymore. It was about justice. About reclaiming the part of me that had been stolen, one shattered piece at a time. The house felt wrong. Too quiet. I could hear the soft drip of rain coming through the broken window, and the old grandfather clock in the living room ticked steadily, like a heartbeat in a place that had lost its warmth. Memories haunted the walls, pictures of Maggie and me, of better times, holidays, laughter. Now they felt like ghosts, things that didn't belong anymore. I tried to breathe, to stay calm, but I was tired. Exhausted. Yet the anger kept me moving, even when I thought I had nothing left. It burned inside, giving me the strength I needed. Upstairs, Maggie's footsteps creaked on the floor. She was moving around, maybe crying, maybe packing her things. I didn't care. My feelings for her were buried deep under everything that had happened tonight. I grabbed a broom from the corner and swept up the broken glass. The sharp pieces clinked together as I pushed them into a pile. It was almost funny how I could clean up shattered glass but not the mess our marriage had become. I tried to focus, just on the sweeping, on doing something that made me feel in control. When the glass was finally in the trash, my phone buzzed. The sound cut through the silence, and I grabbed it fast, almost dropping it. It was Rick. His message was short, done. He'll get the message tomorrow. My hand tightened around the phone. I felt a small bit of satisfaction, knowing that the man who had ruined my life was about to learn a lesson. But I also felt something else, a guilt that whispered I was crossing a line I'd never come back from. There was no way to stop now. I'd set things in motion, and there was no turning back. I shoved the phone into my pocket and walked into the living room. The photos on the walls mocked me, each one a reminder of what I'd lost. I stared at one of them, a picture of me and Maggie from years ago, and I almost ripped it down. But I stopped. Destroying memories wouldn't fix this. I needed something else. I went out to the garage. It was dark and smelled like oil and old sawdust. The shelves were cluttered with tools and projects I never finished. I opened my old toolbox and pulled out some duct tape, zip ties, and a flashlight. My hands were steady. I felt no fear, only the determination to make sure Maggie understood that she couldn't get away with what she did. I remembered something then. Years ago, when we'd just bought this house, there had been a break-in. Maggie had clung to me, terrified, and I'd promised her I'd keep her safe. That no one would hurt her while I was around. Now, I wondered how things had come to this. How I had become the one she might fear. I stared at my reflection in a cracked mirror in the garage. The man looking back at me seemed like a stranger. My jaw was set, eyes cold. I didn't recognize myself. But I had no choice. Maggie had made hers, and now I had to make mine. I took the supplies back inside and set them on the kitchen table. Every step I took, every decision I made, seemed to make me colder, more resolved. Maggie had to understand that betrayal came with consequences. The storm outside had quieted, but the storm inside me was just getting started. And I was ready for whatever came next. Morning light crept through the grey clouds, dull and lifeless. I hadn't slept at all. I sat in the living room for hours, the time crawling by, one painful second at a time. My hands were still, but inside, I felt restless and raw. The anger hadn't left, but it had settled into something heavier. Maggie stayed upstairs the whole night. I knew she was up there, maybe lying awake, maybe crying. I didn't care anymore. Whatever she felt, it was her burden now, not mine. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. The noise startled me. I grabbed it and looked at the screen. It was a text from Rick. "It's done." He got the message. "Let me know if you need more." I put the phone down, feeling a rush of relief mixed with dread. The man who had messed up my life had been taught a lesson. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. What I'd started couldn't be undone. I'd crossed into something I couldn't walk away from. Footsteps on the stairs broke my thoughts. Maggie appeared at the top, looking wrecked. Her hair was a mess, her eyes swollen from crying. She held onto the railing, looking like she might fall apart any second. When she looked at me, she flinched. I guess I did look different to her. Maybe even dangerous. "Henry," she said, voice cracking. "What happened to us?" Her words made something snap inside me. I wanted to yell, to make her see what she'd done, but I was too tired. The fight had drained out of me, leaving only a deep, aching sadness. "You broke us," I said, my voice flat. "You made your choice, Maggie." She took a shaky step down, then another. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Tears ran down her face. "I never meant to hurt you. I was lost, and I didn't know how to fix it." Her apology felt empty. "Too late. We can't fix this," I said, harsher than I meant. "You broke something that can't be repaired." Maggie dropped to her knees, sobbing. It was a painful sight, but I felt nothing. No pity. No love. Just emptiness. I turned away, needing to get out before I said or did something I'd regret. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door. The need to escape was overwhelming. As I stepped outside, I paused, looking back at her one last time. She was broken, but so was I. And nothing would ever be the same again. "This isn't over," I said quietly. "We have a lot left to settle." Then I walked out into the gray, windy morning, not knowing where I was going, just knowing I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours. The roads were slick from the rain, and the gray sky seemed endless, stretching out like a heavy blanket over everything. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. What had my life turned into? How had everything fallen apart so quickly? The image of Maggie crying on the floor wouldn't leave my mind. Part of me wanted to feel something, guilt, sadness, even regret. But all I felt was emptiness. A cold, numbing emptiness that made me wonder if I'd ever feel normal again. Eventually, I found myself on a road that led out of town, past old fields and forgotten farms. It was a route I hadn't taken in years, not since the days when I was a different man. Back then, I had friends who knew how to solve problems in ways that weren't always legal. Rick was one of them. Rick had always been the kind of guy who could handle anything. Tough, experienced, with a past full of bad decisions that he wore like a badge of honor. He never asked questions, he just did what needed to be done. That's why I'd called him. Because I knew he could make things happen, even if it meant crossing lines I'd never thought I would. I pulled into the parking lot of a small, run-down bar on the edge of town. The neon sign flickered, half the letters burned out, but I could still make out the name, A Rusty's Tavern. It was a place where people went to forget, to drown their troubles in cheap whiskey and bad decisions. The bar was nearly empty. A few tired-looking men hunched over their drinks, lost in their own problems. I found Rick sitting in a booth near the back, a cigarette hanging from his lips. His hair was grayer than I remembered, but the hard look in his eyes was the same. "Henry," he said when he saw me, his voice rough and scratchy. "Didn't expect to see you here so soon." I slid into the booth across from him. "I needed to get out of the house," I said, trying to sound steady. But my voice cracked, betraying how broken I felt. Rick studied me for a moment, then took a drag from his cigarette. "I did what you asked," he said. "The guy got the message. I made sure he won't forget it." I nodded, but I didn't feel the relief I'd expected. Instead, a heavy weight settled deeper in my chest. Did he fight back? I asked, not sure if I even wanted to know the answer. Rick blew out a cloud of smoke and shook his head. No. He was scared out of his mind. Guys like him, they think they're untouchable until reality smacks them in the face. He paused, his eyes narrowing. But what about you? You think this fixes anything? I didn't answer right away. My hands tightened into fists under the table. No, I admitted. It doesn't fix anything. But it's a start. Rick leaned forward, his gaze intense. Be careful, Henry. This road you're on, it only leads to darker places. Trust me, I've been there. I swallowed hard, feeling the truth of his words settle like a stone in my gut. I don't know any other way, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Everything's gone. Everything I thought I knew, it's gone. Rick's expression softened, just a little. He reached across the table, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. Sometimes, you gotta let things go, he said. Or they'll eat you alive. The words hit me harder than I expected. I looked down at the table, at the scratches and cigarette burns, and wondered if there was any way to come back from this. If there was any way to save the man I used to be. But then I remembered Maggie, the betrayal, the way my life had unraveled. And the cold anger came back, stronger than ever. I can't let it go, I said, pushing his hand away. Not yet. Rick sighed, leaning back. Your call, he muttered. Just don't say I didn't warn you. I got up, feeling more lost than ever. The bar felt smaller, the air heavier. As I walked out, the sun was just beginning to break through the clouds, but it didn't bring any warmth. Only a reminder that the storm was far from over. The drive back home felt longer than it should have. The roads were still wet, and the sky stayed a heavy, dull gray, but I barely noticed. My mind was too full, swelling with everything Rick had said, and everything I knew I had to do. I felt like I was moving in a fog, caught between the past I'd just dug up and the future I was about to face. When I pulled into the driveway, Maggie's car was still there. That didn't surprise me. Where else would she go? Our house had always been her safe place, and now it was the one place she couldn't escape from. I shut off the engine, but I didn't get out right away. Instead, I sat there, the quiet pressing down on me. My old Chevrolet Impala felt like a bubble where I could catch my breath, but I knew I couldn't hide forever. Eventually, I opened the door and stepped into the cold, damp air. The house loomed over me, familiar yet foreign, like it had been drained of every good memory. I walked to the front door, my boots heavy on the wet ground. I didn't know what I'd find inside, but I braced myself for anything. When I stepped into the house, Maggie was sitting at the kitchen table. She had a mug of coffee in front of her, but she wasn't drinking it. Her hands were wrapped around the mug like she was trying to find some comfort, some warmth. Her eyes were red, and her face was pale. She looked up when I came in, but she didn't say anything. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I set my keys down on the counter, the small sound echoing through the room. We need to talk, I said finally, breaking the silence. My voice sounded rough, even to me. Maggie nodded slowly, her hands tightening around the mug. I know, she whispered. But I don't even know where to start. I walked over and leaned against the counter, keeping some distance between us. I didn't trust myself to get too close. Not yet. Start with why, I said. Why him? Why now? Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, ashamed. I didn't plan for it, she said. It just happened. We were falling apart, Henry. You know we were. It felt like you weren't even here anymore. The anger flared up, but I forced myself to stay calm. So that's your excuse? I asked, my voice low. You were lonely, so you decided to destroy everything we built? She flinched, her shoulders sagging. I didn't mean to destroy anything, she said, her voice cracking. I was lost, and he made me feel seen, like I mattered again. I clenched my jaw, the coldness in me growing stronger. And now? Do you think you still matter to him, after what happened last night? I didn't give her time to answer. Because I made sure he knows the price of stepping into my life. Maggie's head snapped up, fear flashing in her eyes. What did you do? She whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted her to feel that fear, to understand that I wasn't the man she thought she could walk all over. I did what I had to do, I said. Just like you made your choices, I made mine. Her hands started to shake, and she let go of the mug, pushing it away. This isn't you, Henry, she said, tears streaming down her face. I don't know who you are anymore. I felt the sting of her words, but I didn't let it show. Maybe you never really knew me, I replied, my voice cold and distant. Maybe neither of us knew each other as well as we thought. The room felt smaller, closing in around us. I could hear the rain starting up again outside, a soft patter that felt like it was marking time, counting down to something. Maggie wiped at her tears, her hands trembling. I knew she was scared, and part of me wanted to comfort her. But another part, the part that had been hurt, betrayed, wanted her to understand just how deeply she had cut me. I don't know how to fix this, she said, her voice breaking. I don't even know if it can be fixed. I pushed off the counter, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. It can't, I said simply. Not the way it was before. But we're not done, Maggie. Not by a long shot. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and full of something I couldn't quite name. Fear? Hope? Desperation? Maybe a mix of all three. But I couldn't afford to care. Not yet. There was still too much left unsaid, too much that needed to be settled. Without another word, I turned and headed upstairs. I needed space, time to think. To plan. Because this was far from over, and I wasn't about to let her or anyone else decide how my story would end. The bedroom felt cold, even though the heat was on. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. My hands were still shaking, and my heart felt like it was pounding too hard in my chest. The silence in the house was suffocating. Maggie's words played over and over in my head. I didn't mean to hurt you. I felt lost. It was supposed to mean something, I guess, supposed to explain what she had done. But it didn't. All it did was make me feel emptier. I stood up and walked to the window. The rain had started up again, tapping softly against the glass. Outside, the yard was soaked, puddles forming in the uneven ground. Everything looked washed out, grey and lifeless. Just like how I felt. I needed to do something. Anything to shake off the numbness. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but now it was mixed with something else. Something darker. Desperation, maybe. A need for control, for justice, for something that would make me feel less like a fool. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me out of my thoughts. I pulled it out and saw a message from Rick. He won't be bothering you anymore, it read. Simple, direct, and final. I should have felt relief. That man, the one who had dared to invade my life, who had taken Maggie from me in more ways than one, had been dealt with. But instead, I felt a strange sense of unease. Like the darkness was settling in, making itself at home. I was about to put my phone away when I heard a noise from downstairs. A thump, followed by the sound of something scraping across the floor. My body tensed, and I listened closely. Another noise, this time more distinct, footsteps. Someone was moving around down there. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the side of the bed. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. My mind raced. Was it him? The man Rick had warned off? Had he come back for more? Or was it someone else entirely? Heart pounding, I made my way down the stairs, one step at a time. The house felt different, full of shadows that seemed to watch me. When I reached the bottom, I saw the back door slightly open, rain blowing in through the gap. I clenched the bat tighter, moving toward the door. My breath came out in short, shallow bursts, and I tried to steady myself. The anger from before mixed with fear, making my hands sweaty. I nudged the door open wider with the bat, ready for anything. But there was no one there. The yard was empty, silent except for the rain. I took a step back, confusion clouding my mind. Had I imagined it? Had the storm just blown the door open? Then I heard a sound behind me. Quick, light footsteps. I spun around, raising the bat, but it was just Maggie. She stood at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes wide with shock at the sight of me, armed and ready to fight. "Henry, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling. I lowered the bat, feeling foolish. "I thought someone was here," I said, my voice trailing off. The door was open. Her eyes filled with fresh tears. "We can't live like this," she whispered. "This fear, this anger, it's tearing us apart." I wanted to argue, to tell her this was her fault, that she was the one who had invited chaos into our lives. But I couldn't find the words. The exhaustion was catching up to me, making everything feel heavy. She was right. We couldn't keep going like this. But I also knew that forgiveness, if it ever came, was a long way off. I couldn't sleep that night. The house was too quiet, and every shadow seemed to shift, making me feel restless and uneasy. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind running through everything that had happened. Every argument, every betrayal, every moment that led us to this point. Maggie had gone back to the guest room. I could hear her moving around earlier, trying to settle, but now it was silent. The kind of silence that made your chest feel heavy. I wondered what she was thinking. Was she scared of me now? Was she regretting everything she had done? I didn't have the answers, and I wasn't sure I wanted them. At some point, I got up and made my way downstairs. The floor creaked under my feet, the familiar sounds of the house feeling strange, like I was hearing them for the first time. I walked into the kitchen and flipped on the light. The broken glass from the earlier storm had been cleaned up, but the kitchen still looked like a mess, a reflection of everything wrong in our lives. I poured myself a drink, whiskey from the bottle I kept in the back of the cabinet. The burn of the alcohol didn't bring comfort, but it dulled the edges of my thoughts a little. I sat at the table, the same table where Maggie had once laughed with that other man. I clenched my jaw, the memory hitting me like a punch. Was there any way to fix this? Could I ever move past what she had done? Or had we destroyed everything beyond repair? The sound of footsteps made me look up. Maggie stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold the pieces together. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. She looked tired, worn down, like she'd aged years in a single night. "I couldn't sleep," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't say anything at first. Just looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the woman I'd loved for over 40 years. The woman I'd built a life with, shared dreams and memories with. And now, she was someone I barely recognized. "Me neither," I said finally, my voice rough. I took another sip of whiskey, letting the silence stretch out between us. She took a hesitant step forward. "Henry, I know I can't undo what I've done," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I hurt you in ways that can't be fixed. But I don't know how to let go of everything we were." Her words hung in the air, and I felt a wave of anger rise, hot and suffocating. But there was also a deep, painful sadness. because she was right. We had been something once, something good. And now we were just a broken mess. I don't know how to let it go, either, I admitted, my hands gripping the glass so hard I thought it might shatter. But I don't know how to move forward, either. Every time I look at you, I see what you did. What we lost. Tears spilled down her face, and she didn't try to wipe them away. I hate what I did, she whispered. I hate myself for it. But I still love you, Henry. Even if I don't deserve your love anymore. The words cut through me, leaving me raw and exposed. Love. After everything, it was still there, buried under the pain and betrayal. I hated that I still cared, that some part of me still wanted to protect her, to hold on to the life we'd built. But the anger and hurt were bigger than that, louder than any love I had left. Love isn't enough anymore, I said, my voice breaking. It doesn't fix this. It doesn't make it better. She took another step closer, desperation in her eyes. Then what do we do? She asked. How do we survive this? I didn't have an answer. All I had was the weight of everything we'd lost and the uncertainty of what came next. I set the glass down and stood up, feeling more tired than I ever had in my life. I don't know, I said. But we can't keep pretending everything's okay. We can't live in this house like strangers, waiting for something to change. She nodded, her shoulders slumping. We both knew it wouldn't be that simple. There was too much damage, too much history. But it was a start. A painful, uncertain start. Without another word, I turned and walked back upstairs. The whiskey had left a bitter taste in my mouth, but the bitterness in my heart was worse. And as I lay down in bed, I realized that no matter what happened, the road ahead was going to be long and hard. The morning came slowly, grey light filtering through the thin curtains in our bedroom. I was already awake, lying on my back and staring at the ceiling. The house was still, but not peaceful. It felt heavy, like all the memories and broken dreams were pressing down on us. I heard Maggie moving around downstairs. The sound of her footsteps, the creak of the old floorboards, they used to be comforting. Now, they just made me feel hollow. Today was the day everything changed. The day we finally faced what had become of us. I got up, dressed slowly, and made my way downstairs. Maggie was in the living room, her suitcase by the door. Her eyes met mine, and there was a mix of fear, sadness, and something like hope. But I didn't know if there was any hope left for us. We have to sign the papers, I said, my voice steady but tired. The lawyer will be here soon. She nodded, her shoulders slumping. I know, she replied, her voice quiet. It's just hard to believe it's come to this. The anger that had been simmering inside me finally boiled over. I walked past her to the front door, threw it open, and turned back to look at her. You think this is hard to believe? I snapped. You think this is unfair? I stormed past her, heading up the stairs two at a time. I reached our bedroom, and without thinking, I grabbed her clothes from the closet. Dresses, blouses, and sweaters came off their hangers in a whirlwind. I dragged an armful to the window, threw it open, and tossed her things outside. They fell onto the wet lawn, some landing in puddles, others blowing in the wind. Maggie ran up the stairs, eyes wide with disbelief. What are you doing? She cried, tears streaming down her face. I turned to her, my chest heaving with anger. I'm making sure you understand, I said. You lost the right to stay in this house, in this life, when you decided I wasn't enough for you. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked at the pile of her belongings outside, her suitcase still waiting by the door downstairs. The pain in her eyes cut deep, but I didn't let myself soften. Not this time. I grabbed more of her things, throwing them out the window with a force that made the glass rattle. She didn't try to stop me. She just stood there, broken, watching as the last remnants of her presence in our home were scattered across the lawn. Finally, I dropped the last item, breathing hard. The rage that had fueled me was starting to fade, leaving only exhaustion. Maggie turned away, wiping at her tears with shaking hands. "I'll go now," she whispered. "I won't make this harder than it already is." I followed her downstairs, but this time, there were no more words. Just silence, thick and suffocating. She picked up her suitcase, her fingers clutching the handles so tightly that her knuckles turned white. At the door, she paused, looking back at me one last time. There were tears in her eyes, but she tried to smile, a sad, broken thing that made my chest ache. "Goodbye, Henry," she whispered. "Goodbye, Maggie," I replied, the words catching in my throat. She stepped outside, and I watched as she loaded her suitcase into the car. The engine roared to life, and she drove away, disappearing down the street. I stood there for a long time, listening to the rain, feeling the emptiness settle in. The house felt even quieter now, like the echoes of everything we'd been were finally gone. I walked to the window and looked out at the mess of clothes scattered across the yard. The rain fell harder, soaking everything, washing away the last traces of her. We had built a life together, Maggie and I, 44 years of love, laughter, dreams, and promises. But now, all of that was gone. The only thing left was the memory of what we used to be, and the long, uncertain road ahead of me. I didn't know what the future held. But I knew that, somehow, I had to learn to live with the pieces.